To get started. All right, let's get started. Alienation and Marxian and Fanonian formulation. And my position is a Marxist with Fanonist thought, decolonial Marxism. The concept of alienation has been extensively discussed and debated. Geyer, 1972 to 1974, compiled a bibliography on the topic and found more than 1,800 books, articles, and dissertations on alienation. What do you want me to do, Joe?
Wait. Yeah, Carrot said yes.
Okay. Hold on a second. Just don't want to give people mods that they don't want it. You know what I mean? All right, there you go. There is reasons to believe that this bibliography, which covers work written prior to 1974, is nowhere exhausted. In addition, a great deal more has been written on alienation since 1974. Few concepts have been so readily invoked in common parlance and serious works on the concept of alienation to refer to various conditions, processes, and experiences. Frequently, the concept is used for purposes of description and social criticism, and with perspective implications. Indeed, alienation has become an omnibus diagnosis for economic, social, psychological, and existential malaise. Various disciplines have appropriated the concept for their own ends, defined it according to their specialized language, and attempt to verify it. Oh my gosh, I already got a visible restriction. Jesus Christ. They're so iffy on that shit. Various disciplines have appropriated the concept for their own ends, define it according to their specialized language, and attempt to verify it with their particular methods. The concept has thus acquired numerous meanings and has been invoked for so many, quote, evils that some have suggested discarding it altogether. The fact is, however, there is hardly a concept as pertinent to the situation of oppression as alienation. Contrary to some claims, its value actually rests on its synthesizing power. But a dynamic concept, being a dynamic concept, it not only relates experiences to social conditions, it also entails a critique. The critique also implies a solution, but this assumes first the avoidance of a glib application of a concept, and second, an appreciation for its historical as well as its conceptual foundation. The concept has a long past and has gone through many reformulations, most notable by Rousseau, Hegel, and Fanon and Marx. Fanon too used alienation as a descriptive, diagnostic, and prescriptive guide. His application of the concept had a Marxian influence, even though he chose to emphasize some aspects, i.e., psychological and culture, more than others, i.e., economic and class. Meseroso, 1970, can't say his name correctly, presented perhaps the most careful and informative review of Marx's theory of alienation. There are four major aspects to alienation in Marxian formulation. Here we go. A, man's alienation from nature. B, man's alienation from himself. C, man's alienation from his species being. And D, man's alienation from man. The first aspect, Marx refers to it as, quote, an estrangement from let me read it again. The first aspect Marx refers to as, quote, an arrangement from the thing, which means the alienation of the worker from the product of his labor. That is, the alienation of that which mediates his relations to the sensual external world, and hence to other objects of nature. What the worker produces is not his own, but rather someone else's. It meets not his but alien needs. It is a commodity he sells to eke out the bare existence. The more he produces, the more his product, and hence the objects of nature stand opposed to him. The second aspect Marx refers to is as, quote, self-estrangement, which emphasizes the worker's relations to the act of production itself. The process by which he produces permeates him to intrinsic satisfaction. His, quote, life activity, which should be spontaneous, free, and creative, is coerced, controlled, and regimented. He engages in work not for its own sake, as an expression of his essential being, or of his natural activity, but for a wage to permit him only animal existence, eating, drinking, sleeping, etc. In consequence, the worker is alienated from his own activity, which also is alienated from his body, cognition, and effect. He is alienated from himself. The third aspect refers to the negation of human essence, insomuch as the worker is denied actualization of his inherent human potential through activity. That is, man expresses, objectifies, and duplicates his, quote, species being. His human essence, through his labor, affirming not only his personality, but also the humanity he shares with others. Without his life activity, everything about him remains implicit, unrealized, and unrecognized. When his labor is alienated, so too is his humanness. Through activity, he leaves his mark in the world, transforming objects around him, which in turn transforms him. Because of alienated labor, his being remains alien to him and to others. Finally, the fourth aspect refers to the estrangement of man from other men. Although the third aspect emphasizes alienation from mankind in general, the fourth aspect concerns alienation from specific others by virtue of class contradictions. Yeah, thank you. Okay, cool. It should be stressed that at the conceptual kernel of the Marxian formulation is a dialectical reciprocity between man, productive activity, and nature. A threefold interaction permeates these constituent parts. Man is part of nature, but he also humanizes nature. With his activity, he creates and is created. Capitalism divides society into private property and owner, on the other hand, the wage labor and worker, on the other hand. It is to this antagonistic opposition of man against man, with the violence and degradation it entails, that the fourth aspect of alienation refers. One can see from the preceding that in Marxian formulation, all four aspects of alienation reduced to characteristics of alienated labor. For according to Marx, the root cause of alienation resides in the substructure of society, in particular the alienation of productive labor engendered by the capitalist mode of production. Contrary to vulgar materialist claims, however, the Marxian formulation is dialectical, showing the reverberation of alienated labor in all domains of social and psychological life. Alienation was also a central and synthesizing concept for Fanon. There is no doubt that Fanon was greatly influenced by the Marxian formulation on alienation. The influence was partly direct, since there is an indication that Fanon studied Marx, and partly indirect, since the writers he vividly read, Césaire and Sartre were themselves influenced by Marxism. At the same time, Fanon was a psychiatrist and hence interested in the exposition of alienation from a psychological perspective. Hold on, they're saying something. The personal oh my gosh, you're saying a lot. It draws the same point/aspect like that of the saying, the first rev is when you change your mind. Personal empowerment of societal transformation both begins with fundamental shift in the consciousness, perception, beliefs, psychology, and of persons. Thank you. Alienation was also a central and oh wait, I already read that. All right, hold on a second. There is no doubt that Fanon was greatly influenced by the Marxian formulation on alienation. The influence was partly direct, since there is an indication that Fanon studied Marx, and partly indirect, since the writers he avidly read, Césaire, Sartre include, were themselves influenced by Marxism. At the same time, Fanon was a psychiatrist, and hence interested in the exposition of alienation from a psychological perspective. His exposure to existentialism, phenomenology, and psychoanalyst further enriched his perspective on alienation. Conclusion: the perception. Okay, yeah. As pointed out earlier, Fanon was a personal friend of Sartre. Moreover, he attended some lectures of Merleau-Ponty during his student days in Lyons. Above all, however, his personal experience and observation among the oppressed gave poignancy and relevance to his exposition of alienation. Zahar, 1974, as noted earlier, presented a detailed discussion on Fanon's perspective on alienation. Rather than merely recapitulating Zahar, it seems more appropriate here to quote, reconstruct Fanon's formulation from his various works in order to present a developmental perspective. But before, okay, yes, great, you improved me, great. But before embarking on such a developmental presentation, it must be emphasized that Fanon's perspective of alienation continuously changed in substance and accent. Fanon's first book, Black Skin's White Mask, was primarily a psycho-existential thrust. He thus focused on the prejudice of whites and the feeling of inferiority of black people. Relying heavily on case studies and personal accounts, Fanon articulated the dynamics of interpersonal problems and experiential anguish. In the midst of a European society and in the thoroughly colonized Antilles, though his critique and analysis was poignant, his earlier solution to alienation was ambiguous. At best, two solutions were offered, one for the black intellectual and another for the black laborer. For the former, it was implied to be a question of rediscovering one's lost identity through self-analysis and the study of black history. For the latter, it was said that nothing is left but to fight. Life and work in Algeria brought to the fore much that was implicit earlier and enriched Fanon's conception of alienation. The psycho-existential emphasis was supplanted by a psycho-historical perspective. Psychology considerations, of course, persisted, but interpersonal difficulties of existential. Oh my gosh! I said it earlier. Now I can't say it. Dang brain! Damn you, brain! Please let me say it.
Existential.
Yeah, I thought it. Existential crisis were subsumed under more comprehensive and clear view of social structures and cultural problems evident in colonial Algeria. Clinical data were thus used to complement and concretize the critique of colonial violence and collective victimization. Substructural problems involving social practice in institutions and the mode of production were emphasized. The consideration of culture, no longer married by reactive and metaphysical assertions, as in negritude, with which Fanon briefly flirted, became directly linked to the realities of the nation. What is more, the solution of alienation was articulated as nothing short of total war, a coordinated and collective counter-violence against the violence of the oppressor. We have already seen Fanon's formulation of violence. Taken together, Fanon works suggest 5 aspects of alienation. A, alienation from the self. B, alienation from significant others. C, alienation from the general other. D, alienation from one culture. And E, alienation from creative social practice. The first aspect involves alienation from one's corporality and personal identity. The second emphasizes an estrangement from one's family and group. The third is best shown by the violence of the paranoia characterizing the relations between whites and black people. The fourth involves estrangement from one's language and history. The fifth concerns the denial and or abdication and self-determining socialized and organized activity and the very foundation of the realization of human potential. These five aspects were implicit in the integrated in Fanon's work. They are delineated here for the purpose of summary and clarification. As would be expected, Fanon immersion in clinical work in his pained awareness of differentiation. Hold on. 204. I didn't ask for the pronunciation. Oh my God. What? Come on. Aren't you? What the hell is wrong? Sorry, everybody. I'm still trying to get it. Deracination. All right, what's deracination mean? Deracination, the active process of pulling something by the roots, deraceration, led him to emphasize alienation from the self and from culture. Following brief discussion of Fanon's formulation on alienation begins here. He himself began. Fanon began Black Skins, White Masks, 1976. With the theme of cultural alienation, exemplified by the imposition of a European language on black people in the diaspora. Quote, to speak of language, he wrote, quote, is to take on the world, a culture. The Antilles black person who wants to be white will be whiter as he gains greater mastery of the cultural tools that the language is. In the case of the Martinican, the culture and the language imposed were French. It took pains to speak, quote, the French of France and the Frenchmen's French, end quote. All the while avoiding Creole, except to give orders to servants. The fact of having to speak nothing but the other's language, when this other was the conqueror, ruler, and oppressor, was at once an affirmation of him, his worldview, and his values, a concession to his framework, and an estrangement from one's history, value, and outlook. As we have seen earlier, the imposition of European culture and language on black people in the diaspora was realized through massive violence, forcing the history, culture, and genealogy of black people into oblivion. Culture always has had an intimate dialectical link with the prevailing mode of production and the prevalent mode of psychological existence. Economic exploitation becomes possible to the extent that the culture and hence the history of biography of the dominant is sequestered, stunted, and obliterated. Culture deracination of black people was but the intellectual and emotional counterpart of of economic enslavement. The Middle Passage uprooted bodies, transporting them to alien lands. Culture disintegration, dereciation, can't say it, dislocated psyches, imposed an alien worldview. One can thus speak of cognitive and affective middle passage in the culture. Oh my gosh, it's the same word that I couldn't pronounce. Deriation of black people.
It's
Like
eracination.
Deracination, yes, thank you. Like the historic middle passage involving the movement of bodies across the Atlantic Ocean from one continent to another, so to the uprooting of psyches from their culture and their assertion into another, in which the basic values were pro-white and anti-black, elicited and victimization, difficult and quantify, but very massive. What Fanon was thus emphasized was that this act was acquiescent.
Acquiesce. I'm sorry.
I said it. Hold on a second.
It's acquiesce.
I know.
To allow.
To accept, comply, or agree on something passive and reluctantly, usually by staying silent or avoiding protest.
Acquiesce.
Yeah. To and embrace the oppressor's culture, leaving behind what is left of one's own, is to plunge oneself into profound alienation in all its varieties and anguish. Fanon elaborated on culture alienation and its consequences elsewhere. In this stable society of Europe, he argued, there is a continuity and synchrony among three main domains: the nation, the family, and the identity of members. The family and the nation turn on the same axis. The family is in fact a miniature of the nation. Both are governed by essentially the same values, laws, and principles. Both observe similar rituals, resort to common admonition. I'm gonna look at that. I'm gonna say it.
Admonitions. It's to
Thank you.
To allow.
Thank you. Admonition. Got it. Thank you. And takes the same punitive measure to ensure conformity and to exert control. A basic interdependence exists between them because the nation is but a sum of its families. Even the very structure of authority relations in the nation corresponds to the authority relations in the family. The militaristic nation fosters farther dominance. The autocratic and centralized nation promotes strict discipline and obedience in the family. Where goes the nation, so follows the family. How the family socializes a member also prepares the citizen of the nation. The continuity and synchron existing between the nation and the family ultimately give rise to the national culture and collective bonds and a sense of common destiny. Analogous continuity and synchrony. I'm gonna look it up. Synchrony. Let's look at that up. They're saying it a lot.
Synchrony.
I said it right. A state of two more things occurring, developing, or operating simultaneously at the same time. Also exists between the family and the identity of its members. Child grows up in a stable European society, grows in a relatively stable family constellation. The values he internalizes, the parental rules he observes, the forms of self-expression he is permitted, all these prepare and guide him along a normative course of socialization. The child stories he is told, the family and the family members after whom he models himself, also impart to him acceptable modes of catharsis and egocentric view of himself, a shared sense of belonging. The child grows in this stable family constellation and later emerges from the intimate circle to encounter the wider social world governed by similar values, laws, and principles. The result is that the normal child who grows up in a normal family will be a normal adult. If and when some abnormality occurs under these conditions, the clinician searches for defects in the individual or, at best, in his family circumstances. The social structure is readily vindicated, recedes in the background. A psychology of individual differences gain theoretical prominence, and individual therapy becomes one treatment of choice. The colonial situation, in contrast, fosters neither continuity between the nation and the family, no synchrony between the family and the identity of its members. The social structure exists primarily for the purpose of exploitation. Violence, crude and subtle, brought it into existence and maintains it. This violence pervading the social order in time affects the life of the colonized in a most fundamental way. The indigenous social structure is dislocated. The family institution subsequently is disrupted. The identity of members also is constantly assaulted. In the situation of prolonged oppression is found among Black people in the diaspora. The oppressor had long obliterated the culture, language, and history of the oppressed. It is here less a question of discontinuity of the social structures in the family or the family and personal identity than of massive swamping of the family and a profound intrusion into the psyche. The Black child in Martinique is taught to sing songs and praise about, quote, our ancestors, the Gauls. At home and in school, he is taught to scorn Creole and the values it represents. He also talks, dresses, eats, and lives meticulously conforms to the rules laid down by the dominant group. This is so particularly among those who economic and class standing permits dreams and of greater assimilation into the white world. By crude and subtle means, the development of personal biography and the reckoning of collective history, apart from the biographies and history of whites, are discouraged and suggested earlier. What makes this process of negation so insidious and so difficult to overcome is the fact that one's loved ones, along with the family hearth in which one was socialized, have unwittingly been enlisted as instruments of the prevailing social order. Memories of harsh punishment meted out for resistors of the past are still fresh in the collective psyche, and one needs no more convincing abomination about the, quote, wisdom
It's admonition.
thank you, of wisdoms of capitulating than to observe the countless employments imprisoned and derived. Even if the family remains relatively intact or little tarnished by this violent social order, the act on the self is merely postponed until one moves away from the intimate circle of the family to the ubiquitous violence of the wider social world. Thus, Black children who grow up in a healthy family environment sooner or later come up against massive social forces that undermine and sometimes overwhelm their development. Since the values, laws, and principles enforced in the social order are largely discordant with those governing life in the family, profound contradictions are inevitable. Since the love of the family is encourages with the violence of the social order, the transition from childhood to adulthood, from the intimate circles of the family to the violent social order, involves inordinate personal conflicts and turmoil. The school, the history books, the comic strips, the theater halls. All these also reinforce cognitive dissonance and even self-hate. The psychic suffocation increases with each progressive step in colonial education. The closer the schoolboy gets to the social circles of the oppressor, the more he learns to disparage what he is by birth and race. On the other hand, he assimilated into the dominant culture, and on the other, he is made to break away from his own culture. As he moves through various stages of colonial education, he progressively reduces his contact with his relatives and the indigenous culture. As the bond with family members grows more tenuous, he increasingly enters the social orbits of the oppressor. Then comes the stage when he must choose either his own group and culture, or the ruling group and its alien outlook. For many, the choice be made long ago follows the Aristotelian logic, which is no middle ground. Acceptance of one entails rejection of the other, and gain in some respect involves a loss in the other. So you see that too. You can see that too with indigenous people in the United States too. A lot of them will have the same type of stories and stuff like that on this too.
White people too, believe it or not, with the assimilation of white culture, we lost our cultures. We lost our German and Irish culture as well. Black people, of course, have it worse always, because they also are constantly looked down upon for still embracing their culture, whereas white people that still embrace their culture are not looked down upon.
But in this particular thing, he's talking about the person that's assimilating into it, not the person that already understands his culture.
Wait, well, that's what I'm talking about. Assimilation into whiteness, no matter where you come from, the assimilation into whiteness is a bad thing.
Yeah, but we're talking about the black person, the subject of black people
Right.
and indigenous people.
Right. I'm just saying this also should, for white people that are in the chat, should also look at this and see what is also happening and happened to their families.
In process of assimilation, the oppressor with the auxiliary and indigenous defector, who by this time he has arrived. The oppressed community loses a member, suffers brain drain, and risks betrayal by one of his own. The family too loses a loved one who, having embraced an alien outlook, returns on occasion only to criticize its traditional ways of living and of being. Fanon illustrates this by recounting the feigned amnesia and pretending mutation of the young Martinican, returning to his village after the few months in France. No sooner did he arrive home than he proceeded to act as if he were a European tourist, and a foolish one at that, pretending that he knew nothing about farm implements. He turned to his father and asked, "Tell me, what does one call this apparatus?" Fanon informs us that the father responded by dropping the tool on the boy's feet. The amnesia suddenly lifted. For most, however, the amnesia of who they are or of their social origins persists, although their repudiation of the traditions of their people is more subtle. The stimulousness
Simultaneous.
Thank you. The simultaneous rejections of one's own and uncritical acceptance of the alien nonetheless presents a fertile ground for psychopathology. The delusion of having arrived there, but the fact of having lost ground here, the fact of being a battleground for many social contradictions, the feeling of being torn between two opposing worlds, all these enact a cumulative and immeasurable toll. Of course, even for the intensely oppressed, there too exist many social buffers, protecting the individual in his own community. The recognition of these buffers and their reinforcement cannot be overemphasized, since without them, there can be neither a protective shield nor a basis for a proactive response. According to Fanon, it is particularly when the black person is cut off from his community and thrown into the white world that structural, institutional, and behavior and personal violence intensifies, and the existential crisis unfolds with poignancy. The black person seeks to his destiny in a country in which whites are the majority, learns quickly that his self and most concretely his body are under constant assault. In his everyday interactions, even chance encounters, he is made to feel a stranger in this world, and ultimately a stranger to himself. On the streets and the shopping centers, he has assailed by stares as tormenting as the remarks made to him about his race. The white child untortured, yet in the hypocrisy of his parents. I said hypocrisy.
The word was you said untortured, and it's untutored.
Yeah, thank you. In his parents' shouts, look at the N-word. The black person initially finds this amusing. He smiles in return elsewhere. And another child, look at the N-word. Everywhere the same alarm. The circle draws tighter, and there is little room to escape. It is no longer amusing. Mama, see the N-word? I'm frightened, end quote. Now, how could one find amusement is causing fear in children and his very body and being? On trains, the black person is kept at a distance, two or three seats next to his remain unoccupied. And one need not dwell on the anger, frustration, and desperation a search for an apartment involves. Besides the stares, the racial slurs, and the distance kept, there are also elaborated cultural myths about the black person's body and sedimented stereotypes about his race. The black person is ugly. The black person smells. The black person is a sexual beast, if not avoided. He is patronized, talking to as a child in a pidgin French. Yeah. Gradually, he is thrown back and re-examined his corporal schema and his very being, a self-concept that started developing in the first few years of life is shaken to its foundation. Agreement with the verdict of this hostility, other inevitability entails a profound existential crisis, a veritable amputation of the self. This is so particularly when the initial edifice of the self was itself tenuous and the family circle had long assimilated the corrosive values of the dominated other. Even even as various defenses maneuvers are installed, the dialect between one's body and the world, between the self and the other, is nonetheless ruptured, because the elaborate racial myths and the evident structures of dominance, whites on top and black people on the bottom, his corporal schema is overlaid by a racial epidermal, a historical racial schema. What is more, he is personally held responsible, not only for his body, but also for his ancestors and his whole race. It is not only a rejection of one's body itself, but also a verdict of internal guilt. In this respect, two primary questions arise. How are these assaults defended against? And if amputation of the self is realized, by what means are the pieces pulled together? Or better still, quote, another self forged? I explore an answer to these questions elsewhere. By processing a theory, I identify of identity development that is implicit in Fanon's writing and personal evolution. In brief, under conditions of prolonged oppression, there are three major modes of psychological defense and identity development among the oppressed. The first involves a pattern of compromise, the second, flight, and the third, fight. Each mode of profound implications for the development of identity, experience of psychopathology, reconstitution of the self, the relationship to others, other people. Each represents a mode of existence, of an action in the world in which a hostile other elicits organic reaction and responses. Each also entail its own distinct risk of alienation and social rewards under conditions of oppression. To go into the detail of the proposed theory here would take us far beyond what space and priorities of this chapter permit. Even though the theory clarifies much about Fanon's thought and personal evolution, suffice it to point out, however, that I discuss the three modes of psychological defense and identity development as stages. The first stage, based on the defensive mechanisms of identification with the aggressor, involves increased assimilation into the dominant culture, while simultaneously rejecting one's own culture. I call this the stage of capitulation. The second stage, exemplified by the literature of negritude, is characterized by a reactive repudiation of the dominant culture and by the equally defensive romanticism of the indigenous culture. I call this stage the revitalization. The third phase is the stage of synthesis, an ambiguous commitment towards radical change. I call this the stage of radicalization. Maybe that's the transformation of beginning a revolution and liberation process. It's the fight back mode. These three stages are best understood within the framework of the historical and cultural confrontations in which they occur. Figure 1 shows three intersecting Venn diagrams representing the dominant culture. And I'm probably going to A, the dominant culture, B, a third culture, which is the status Nicendia, C, the dominant culture comprise the values, beliefs, norms, and outlooks that historically prevail among the oppressed. The dominant culture is that imposed on the oppressed by personal, institutional, and or systematic violence. The degree of culture imposition and hence overlap between A and B varies from one place to another and from one type of expression to another. Frequently, it is less a question of overlap of cultures than an obliteration of one and the supplantation of the other. The culture of status nascendia is partly a synthesis of aspects of the dominant and dominated cultures. The other part, shown by broken lines, represents the emergence of an unquelled, unique aspect of the culture that is in the purpose of formation. The shaded area is the region of culture contact, confrontation, and mutual influences. It is also the zone of, quote, culture in betweenity, in which the black elites reside with respect of the new and the old, the modern and the indigenous. Here, the dominant and dominated cultures coalesce with considerable regularity and intensity on modifying the other, and each loses in, I'm going to read that, consequences its original character. So let's look at this. There's that. Okay. I wish I could read at the same time, but like A is the dominated culture. So A, dominated culture. B is the dominant culture. So you got B. And then C is the emerging culture. Okay. All right. The shaded area is the region of contact, confrontation, and mutual influence. The zone of culture in between in betweenity of the dominated, predominated tendencies, patterns, reaction, or stages of adaptation equals capitulations, revitalization, radicalization. So they said that this is the merging culture. There you go. Hope that was okay. Oh no. Could you mute my get rid of the here, I'll do it. I'll figure it out. If you do it before me, that's cool too. Trying to get rid of
Let me
the
open my moderator settings. I would have to leave
okay,
them there.
okay. No worries. I'll just do this. How do I turn it off? I have to turn it off for right now. Allow comments. So we're turning off comments just for oh my gosh, appeal. Holy shit. Come on. All right, up we go. All right, back. And we go to settings. We go to comment settings and we do this. There we go. All right, thank you, everybody. All right. The consequences, its original, wait. Oh, yeah, I already did that. The dominant culture is promulgated by the ruling group and buttressed by the institutions of social control, as well as by existing patterns of reward. Imposed aspects of the dominant culture may be religious precepts, a mode of thought, a set of values, a pattern of social behavior, and frequently a combination of these. The mediating institutions are usually the oppressor's churches, schools, mass media, hospitals, courts, and other institutions. The arrow in figure 1 indicated the 3 major directions. Okay, so they're going outwards. Okay, outwards from the gray part. Okay, that's the middle that's going outwards. Arrows in figure 1 indicated the 3 major directions open to those inhabiting the zones of cultural in-betweenity. It should be emphasized that one cannot talk of these not only as stages, but also as tendencies or patterns, depending on whether one considers them longitudinally or across sectionally. But whether considered as stages, tendencies, or patterns, it is important to note that none of them exists in a, quote, pure state, nor is any one in a way exclusive of the other. All 3 coexist in each individual and among each generations of the oppressed. With one or another being dominant at a given moment, era, or situation. We have seen in chapter 2 that Fanon traversed all 3 phases in his development, the similar progression of stages, but at different pace and intensities, can also be found, for instance, in the development of Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, Amilcar Cabral, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Malcolm X. Frequently, it happened that ordinary persons remain in one or another phase that is prevalent in their time of social milieu. Thus, for instance, some individuals and even their generations may remain fixated in the stage of capitulation. Others may go beyond this and enter the stage of revitalization with all its charged effects, vehement denouncement of the present, and remarked romanticism of the past. Still others may attain a stage of radicalization on their own, or find themselves in a revolutionary era with potential influences they cannot resist. As soon as I have shown previously, these 3 modes of psychological defense and identity develop have significant implications for the degree and form of alienation among the oppressed, and more generally, the orientation one adopts towards the self, others, one's culture, and social practice. Any questions before we move on?
I have stuff to say, but I don't think you want to hear it. because you seemed kind of upset by what I was saying, but I was identifying, like, they can never become white. But, like, my family's Jewish. I'm second generation American. We still haven't given up. I still haven't given, we haven't given up our development by the time I reached this stage. So, like, I've seen this stuff in development. And I know it happened to you as well because you were Irish. So your family in the past had this happen to them as well, where you have to give up your history, your culture, your ideas, your everything, because what's being attached and attacked on you is whiteness. And that's what happened to them, but they can never achieve the whiteness. So what's happening to them is so much worse because they're trying to, achieve the thoughts and desires and wants of the white society, whereas they're never allowed to achieve it, and it's very hurtful.
Can you do me a favor and not tell me that I'm upset when I'm not? Please? I don't appreciate that. I wasn't upset. I promise.
Okay.
Fanon's radical, social Ginny. Social Ginny. Ooh, what does that mean? Social Ginny. I've heard that word. I know we looked it up too.
Yeah, you're really close to it. It's sociogeny.
A social origins or development of an phenomenon, behavior, or identity.
Sociogeny.
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 Sociogeny. Wow.
Socio.
That's. I'm not gonna be able to do that. Sociogeny. Sociogeny. To Fanon, psychology was essentially social psychology, and psychiatry too was fundamentally social psychiatry. Thus, unlike other theorists, Fanon did not seek to discover human psychology through instructional, genetic, or intrapsychic reductionism. According to him, all human problems must be cast in a definite socio-historical and cultural context. He's saying that the material conditions in the social relations really okay. He's putting it in a materials aspect. I feel like the press of and gravity of living human travails imbued in him a keen sense of urgency and passion, rare among students in psychopathology who boast of their neutrality and detachment. This feeling of urgency and passion is crucial in understanding the theory and practice of Fanon. Not only did he personally experience the massive weight of an oppressive social structure, he also observed its effects on those in the social milieu. The question for him was therefore neither academic nor abstract. Living beings around him were abused, mutilated, dehumanized. The victims were indeed none other than his brother, his sister, himself. Personal experience and observation convinced him that the source of their shared anguish was not bad genes or poor heredity, but rather a specific social structure. What is more, it is only the social order whose genes or heredity that is most amiable to just resolve the human intervention. Thus, to Fanon, the social structures is most crucial in way other psychologists have rarely appreciated. There we go. It is true that some embellishment theorists occasionally concede the significance of the social order, but that concession is often half-hearted and tends to treat the social order as an inert like and fixed background, as a canvas to a painting. Fanon, in contrast, viewed the social structure as a dynamic and potent force, which at once is determinant of human psychology and a result of collective practice. He was convinced that psychological theories that ignore the central roles of the social order tend to blame the victim and also negate the human capacity to transform both the social order and the human psychology. This Fanonian perspective indeed suggest a redefinition of primary tasks for psychology and psychiatry. According to him, the paramount task of psychology and psychiatry are to unravel the relations of the psyche to the social structures, to rehabilitate the alienated, and to help transform social structures that thwart human needs. So basically saying the only way that these things can work is if like we transform ourselves within and destroy the structures that create this, the society that's creating this. So he's definitely taking a materialist approach to this. As we shall see later, this redefinition recognizes the role of biological substrates of human psychology within underestimating the crucial significance of the social order. Insisting on the dialectical conception, Fanon stretched the outline of an sociogenetic perspective. Central to his radical approach was his conviction that seemingly private individual pathology as actually socially induced pathology of liberty. Moreover, Fanon articulated the dialectical and materialist underpinning for his sociogenetic perspective. He emphasized this fact earlier in his introduction of his first book, Black Skin's White Mask. Here it is. The analysis that I am undertaking is psychological. The analysis. I'm surprised you didn't correct me on that. Why'd you not correct me on that? Joe? Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
I'm surprised you didn't correct me on that. Why didn't you do it?
Because I'm intimidated when you sound frustrated with me.
I'm not. Oh my gosh, I'm not frustrated with you.
It happens.
The analysis that I am undertaking is psychological. In spite of this, it is apparent to me that the effective disalienation of the black man entail an immediate recognition of social and economic realities. If there is an inferiority complex, it is the outcome of a double process, primarily economic. Secondarily, the internalization, or better, the, oh my gosh, epidermalization of this inferiority.
Did
Did I say it right? Oh, you said yeah, right?
I said you did good. Good job.
Thank you. This quotation, in fact, contains two concepts that I believe are crucial to the understanding of Fanon's sociogenetic approach to psychology. These are the concepts of internalization and objectification. Internalization refers to the process by which external socio-historical realities is simulated into, quote, internal and subjective reality. Objectification is the reverse process in which man, through practice and particularly labor, actualizes himself and his personality in the world around him. Taken together, internalization and objectification refers to a double process, mediating the dialectic between the human psyche and a socio-environmental world. Oh my gosh, I'm tired of burping. As the quotation indicates, Fanon explicitly refers to the notion of internalization. He even used the term, oh my gosh, here we go, epidermalization.
Do you know what an epidermis is?
I'm gonna look it up.
Okay, so like an epidermis is your skin.
I know.
So, okay, so like an epidermalization, I think, would be something that's deeper than just surface matter.
Let's go find out. Epidermalization is a post-colonial philosophical concept describing how skin color is used to define a person's social identity, as well as a medical term for the, okay, so it's both. Yeah, okay. You're good. You got it. To underscore the profound transformation of economic and inferiority to subjective inferiority. The concept of objectification was never explicitly formulated by Fanon, but such a concept is implicit in his works. Fanon was acutely aware of how the oppressive social structures at once thwart the self-objectification and foster the internalization of negative identities. There is here a double jeopardy. The oppressed is robbed of his labor, the very labor by which he could actualize himself. He also falls victim to the oppressor's damaging assault on the psychic mutilation. Earlier chapters elaborated on the psychological consequences of this double jeopardy. It is sufficient to stress here that Fanon recognized the intimate relations between the psyche and the social order. He was also well aware that the relations is invariably mediated by social institutions and significant others. Fanon's sociogenetic perspective is best appreciated from the aggregate of his contribution. We will select here for the discussion only 3 areas having to do with his definition: the abnormality, his suggestion of an integrative ontological theory. Ooh, what's that word? We're gonna look that word up. I think I looked it up before.
I think it's ideological.
Etiological, the study of assessments, caused origins, or reasons for a phenomenon. Etiological. Yep. Theory superseding the nature versus nurture debate, and his clinical illustration of colonial induced mental disorders. How he defines abnormality is, of course, a crucial first step in comprehending Fanon's revolutionary view of psychopathology. His seminal ideas for the integrative theory suggest a way of overcoming the stalemated predicament in the theory imposed by the either or debate hindering on constructive response to urgent human problems. Moreover, his clinical illustration underscores a crucial significance of the oppressive social structures for psychopathology. Obviously, the definition of abnormal is fundamental to the discussion of psychopathology. Yet, the concept itself and the criteria by which abnormality is identified are subject to various definitions and interpretations. Commonly used.
I just wanted to say, like, when I was in college, I literally studied abnormal psychology, a whole course, a whole semester of a book called Abnormal Psychology, where we studied the history of abnormality and where it came from. And I find it very sad that we did not even touch on Fanon.
Commonly used are one or a combination of 5 approaches. First, there is a statistical approach that identifies normality with conformity to the behaviors and characteristics of the majority of a given society. Deviations from the established norm would thus be identified as abnormal, according to this approach. Second, there is a subjective discomfort approach that relies on personal accounts of distress or for which the person seeks personal help. Third, there is a medical approach that literally or metaphorically invokes the notion of disease, quote unquote, thereby emphasizing the imbalance of biochemical processes and an organic defect. Fourth, there is a cultural relativist approach, relativist approach that emphasizes a variability of definitions, criterion, and symptom expressions from one culture to another. Fifth, there is an approach that assumes ideal states that everyone is expected to embody or approximate. A marked inability to do so is then identified as abnormal. A famous example of this is Marie Jodas's criteria for mental health. These approaches are often used in different combinations and emphasizes by various schools in the field of mental health. Each approach has many advantages attested to by their enduring use in professional and lay circles. At the same time, each approach has its own limitations. Thus, for instance, the statistical approach vindicates the majority against the minority, even though the history of slavery and of Yahtzee era in Germany warns us that there is nothing sacrosanct about the tyranny of the majority. The subjective discomfort approach is useful insomuch as it takes into account personal experience, but also has its own serious limitations as a hypochondriac well illustrates. The problem of the medical model have been sufficiently exposed during the past 2 decades. It has been argued that what is called, quote, mental illness is neither mental nor illness, and that much of psychiatric diagnosis is but a moral verdict. In reality, the cultural relativists and idealist approach are variants of a statistical approach, insomuch as the norms and ideals of the majority, wherever it may be, are assumed to be the defining foundation of normality. So it's they're putting that as a universal. the normal groups, the normal parts of society dictate who is abnormal and who is not.
Right, which is why in our DSM, being queer used to be mental illness, being trans used to be a mental illness, but like as we've come to accept it more in our society, it was taken more and more out of the DSM.
It seems obvious that no single universally relevant approach can be delineated, incorporated the complex ways in which unwanted conduct is defined as abnormal, then graded according to severity. The prognosis suggests an appropriate intervention undertaken. The desires to come up with absolute universal definition for criteria for psychopathology is inevitably frustrated precisely because so much of what is labeled, quote, abnormal, has value, judgmental, and subjective content. Although Fanon does not offer a decisive resolution of these problems, it is significant that he defined abnormality in a way that singularly emphasizes the salience of human relations and liberty. Such a definition is, as well as we shall see, in subsequent chapters, consistent and integral to his overall clinical perspective and practice. Earlier in Black Skin's White Mask, Fanon defined the abnormal as one, quote, who demands, who appeals, and who begs, end quote. At first glance, this is a curious definition indeed. Fanon did not elaborate on what he meant by this definition, and in fact regulates it to a footnote. Both judging from the context in which he mentioned this definition in passing and from his overall perspective, it seems to us that Fanon, convinced of the relational essence of psychopathology, viewed a punitive patient as one who lives in ruptured relations with others and fails to harness his human potentials. One can demand, appeal, beg, and hints be pathological only in the presence of another. The isolated patient with a purely personal pathology is a myth. It takes at least two for a demand, an appeal, and begging, and thus psychopathology to occur. Often it involves more persons, the patient's family, and larger groups. To demand, appeal, and beg is an acquiescence to the prior conditions of non-reciprocity, and perpetuated it by demanding, appealing, and begging. We have already seen the centrality of reciprocal recognition and mutual affirmation of one to another in Fanon's perspective. Demanding, appealing, and begging demonstrate the lack of violations of the mutual give and take and reciprocal equalities essential to a state of normalcy in human relations. One demands one demands, appeals, and begs in the context in which the other is inwardly, they sit inwardly, and stubborn. At the same time, demanding, appealing, and begging betray one's loss of personal dignity, autonomy, and resources. Much later, when he became fully engaged in revolutionary practice, Fanon defined abnormality as a pathology of liberty. This later definition entails two intimately related meanings. First, a patient is one whose liberty, his will, and his desire are constantly broken down by obsession, inhibitions, contradictions, and anxieties. This is a person whose self is divided and at war with itself. Second, and this is very crucial in the Fanon's sociogenetics, and the obsession, the ambition, contradictions, and anxieties are not inhibitions, yes, are not simply expressions of conflictual instincts, but rather the internalization, of social conflicts and imposed limitations of liberty. To occupy one's land entails occupation of one's psyche. To expropriate one's labor is to expropriate one's personality. The agent out there that monitors, punishes, and threatens becomes the intropressor. As we have earlier indicated, in Fanonian perspective, loss of liberty is thus neither accidental nor secondary to psychopathology. Rather, the denial and or abdication of liberty is definitional, ideological, and symptomatic for psychopathology. The critical question is why some respond pathologically and others non-pathologically in situations of shared oppression. There are usually two undialectic answers to this. One emphasizes individual differences at the expense of neglecting the commonality of shared social conditions and experiences. The other stresses the detrimental effects of shared social conditions and neglects individual differences. Fanon recognizes the significance of individuals' differences and thresholds for stress and conflict as he emphasizes the potency of social conditions. For Fanon, psychopathology is essentially a social, historical, and cultural conflict, finding symptoms, crystallization in those with a low personal threshold. His view of the neurosis underscores the point. What Fanon meant, right? Yeah, I think I read that. Point. The neurotic structures of an individual is simply the elaboration and formation, the eruption within the ego. The conflictual cluster arises in part out of the environment and in part out of the purely personal way in which an individual reacts to these influences. What Fanon meant by the environment is quite obvious for his various works. Unfortunately, however, the second precondition, namely the purely personal way of reacting to that environment, was never elaborated, and this renders his psychological theory incomplete. His neglect of this aspect, of course, because he died earlier, he probably would have continued going and going if he didn't have to deal with that. His neglect of this aspect had to do with the urgent press occasioned by the numerous causalities in a colonial situation. Fanon, hold on a second. I gotta do something real quick. Hold on. I have to mute myself.
Okay, so why you mute? I think
I'm done.
the numerous casualties in a colonial situation.
I just lost where I was at. His neglect. Okay, hold on.
Fanon was thus engrossed.
Okay, Fanon was thus engrossed in the exposition and transformation of that intolerable social conditions, and thus neglected also needed studies on individual differences in response to the same situation of oppression. Fanon's suggestion that psychopathology is a result of a personal specific reaction to pathogenic environments nonetheless is a basis for elaborating a dialectic and holistic view. The consideration of his specific threshold together with environmental insults, is thus what Fanon would fully endorse. He actually combined both aspects of his clinical illustrations, but never implicitly elaborated this ideological integration. In the recent literature on etiology, the view that comes closest to Fanon's perspective is the purpose syntheses of Zubin, the Spring. In the article, vulnerability. Thank you. Vulnerability. A new view and don't do it. Schizophrenia. Zubin and Spring integrate previous theories and avoided reductionist conclusions. They argue that earlier descriptive and ideological approaches of, oh my gosh, don't do it, please don't do it, schizophrenia have been theoretically and practically integrated. The search for common elements in these approaches led Zubin and Spring to formulate the vulnerability model. The model incorporated the role of the environment and the personal specific vulnerability to psychopathology. Zubin and Spring define their key concepts of vulnerability as an empirical probability that a person will manifest an episode of psychiatric disorder. Vulnerability has both unborn and acquired components. The unborn component is determined by a person's
Unborn, it's inborn.
Okay, by a person's genes, whereas the acquired features arise due to prenatal assault. Yeah,
Perinatal.
I said that. I said it the second time. Sorry, perinatal insult. That's why I stopped and I would try to sound it out, and I was going to say it. Specific diseases, traumatic experiences.
Perinatal. It's not perinatal. It's perinatal.
Yes, and interpersonal conflicts. An episode of schizophrenia is thus the joint result of one's vulnerability and encountered environmental challengers, which can be either endogenous or exogenous. Let me look these up. I have to look them up anyways.
I was gonna say, if you wouldn't mind looking those up, I don't know those words.
That's what I'm doing.
I think endo would be inside and exo is outside, but yeah.
Endogenous.
Endogenous is growing or originating from within a system, organism, or model. And the other one is exogenous. I said it right. I can't believe I said it right. Growing or originating from within the organism systems. Wait, I did the wrong one. X. What am I doing? It won't let me do X.
Is it exogenous or something?
I'm still trying to look it up. Hold on a second. Exogenous, something that originates from outside a system, organism, or model rather than from within. There we go. The endogenous challengers result from biochemical and neuropsychological processes.
You were wrong. Close though. You had it the second time. Neurophysiological.
Exogenous challengers are such environmental stressors as bereavement, divorce, and unemployment. Everyone can therefore suffer a psychopathological episode giving suitable vulnerabilities and challengers. A highly vulnerable person becomes schizophrenic even under a small number of low intensities of challengers. The oh my gosh, a demotion? Yeah, a demotion or even a promotion at work may trigger an episode of psychopathology in a highly vulnerable person, or less vulnerable individual would manifest similar reactions only under more stressful conditions. Perhaps the catastrophic event involved a multiple loss of loved ones. What further distinguishes the more vulnerable from the less vulnerable is also the duration of the psychopathological episode. In more vulnerable, the episode may last longer and have formidable sequel. In the less vulnerable, the episode may be of shorter duration, with the earlier reconstruction of healthy and appropriate functioning. Zubin and Spring also applied the concepts of accommodations and assimilation to explain the process by which one responds appropriately to life exigencies. Accommodations refer to the temporary and permanent structures, change in the organism to meet environmental demands. Hold on a second. I am going to do a thing and check ahead. Come on, stop moving. Let's make sure. Okay, good. Okay, we're gonna read their what was it? 15? 5 more pages. Read 5 more pages. And then we'll be done, I think. Okay. So we might go a little bit over. Assimilation refers to altering the environmental demands themselves and meeting personal needs. A highly vulnerable person lacks a higher degree, both abilities and uses them inappropriately. An episode of psychopathology may be further prolonged and implicated by the adverse effect in institutionalization and stigmatization. The vulnerability model contains a number of insights and suggests an integrative perspective for the study of psychopathology. The model significantly departs from the nature versus nurture debate. According to it, every person is vulnerable to psychopathology. No specific population, poor or affluent, black or white, has a genetic susceptibility or immunity. Fanon would certainly find much to endorse in this model. He would probably shun its trait bias in the definition of vulnerability, and also oppose the delusion, the delusion of the challenger with androgynous features. Yet there seems to be a basic occurrence in what is implicit in Fanon's work with the model offered by Zebin and Spring. To use Zebin and Spring's concept, Fanon argued that the oppressive social order presents fewer challengers to be beneficiaries, while it subjects the oppressed to greater and more treacherous assaults. Fanon was most impressed with the socioeconomic and cultural importance of challengers on the oppressed, which is often exceeds the threshold of what is humanely tolerable. The economic life of the oppressed is disrupted, his culture disfigured, his history discredited, his social network is eroded, and his family itself dislocated. Also denied him is self-objectification, and his labor is expropriated. Much that he internalizes stands to testify the turn against him. At the same time, Fanon was convinced that the neurotic and alienated is first a victim of others and later of himself. What is more, the neurotic fate remains in his hands. Obsession with individual differences is thus as counterproductive as denial of personal ways of reacting to the environment. According to Fanon, change must occur in both levels. The social conditions that fail to meet human needs must be replaced. And although social transformation makes action is taken, clinical work with causalities of the status quo remains indispensable. As we shall see, it is this combination of social transformative actions and clinically therapeutic practice that makes Fanon's ideas exceptional in the history of the behavioral science. Illustrative
Can I
of
say
his,
something?
yeah,
Okay, so like what I'm understanding is like, for example, two autistic people, one's a black person, one's a white person. The more stress and pressure and racism and taken advantage of, which being done of the black person, will cause the black person to react differently than another autistic person that would have the same type reaction. They would have a much lesser reaction because they're less oppressed and less attacked. Is that correct?
um, he's talking about how those are factors in someone's like thing. But yes, you are right on that part.
Okay, thank you.
Illustrative in his sociogenetic perspective are some 14 clinical cases he presented in Wretched of the Earth. His presentation and analysis of these cases do not, as Fanon himself admitted, have an aim of producing a scientific work. Arguments about semology, nosology, and therapeutic techniques are intentionally set aside in order to underscore the ravages of colonialism and the violence of the struggle for liberation. As we know earlier, this work was written shortly before Fanon's death, and on seeing a measures of haste in the overall work, and particularly the case of histories. Nonetheless, the clinical histories and its illustrative symptoms are eloquent. He sketches a brief analysis attest to the fundamental humanism of Fanon and his pain awareness that violence can never be glorified for its own sake, as some of his detractors have accused him of doing. This, as discussed in Chapter 8, these detractors fail to take into account the oppressive, consuming, and ever-present violence, but expect the oppressed to internally turn their other cheek. Fanon rejects this half-hearted, one-sided, unjust pacifism, which with respect to the oppressed who are left no recourse but to fight in defense. Fanon argued that revolutionary counter-violence offers a means of social reconstruction and psychological liberation. But in spite of this outlook and his efforts to justify the Algerian struggle, Fanon was deeply aware of how corrosive violence can both be the perpetrator and victim, leaving behind devastating and sometimes lasting sequel. Fanon's chapter, quote, Colonial War and Mental Disorder, end quote, is organized into 4 sections. A brief discussion of this chapter, such as we will present here, cannot as we have tried elsewhere to do justice to the clinical rich cases Fanon offered. Our intent here is simply to highlight some of the cases he chose to present and to underscore this obvious sociogenetic import. This psychological crises and personality decompositions are conditioned, precipitated, and or exacerbated by one of the most violent, longest colonial wars. Some of these cases involved what we today would refer to post-traumatic stress disorder, whereas others are so severe as to qualify as reactive schizophrenia in the contradistinction to possess schizophrenia. Each case history Fanon describes demonstrates that the ruthless assaults of the oppressor exceed the tolerance threshold of ordinary persons, and that various psychiatric symptoms represent specifically personal ways of reacting to the violent conditions of oppression. Fanon refers to it as, quote, the variability apocalypse. Variability.
Apocalypse.
Variable apocalypse. This first section, Series A, deals with 5 cases of reactive psychosis. The second section, Series B, provides another 5 cases involving an assortment of issues with forensic and clinical import. The third section, Series C, discusses 4 cases demonstrating the deliberating effects and various techniques of torture. The fourth section, Series D, is the last section, the groups, togethers, psychoasthmatic disorders, and behavioral and criminal behavior. No case illustrates are provided in this section. Only characteristic symptoms are highlighted with a short critique of traditional theories, particularly with respect to the Algerian School of Psychiatry and its explanation of crime among Algerians. The first section begins with the case of an Algerian liberation fighter, age 26, whose wife was tortured and raped by French authorities following the discovery of his guerrilla activities and their failure to apprehend him. Despite interrogations and torture, the wife refused to cooperate and providing information regarding her husband's friends and whereabouts. She was subsequently raped twice by French authorities and told, "If you ever see your filthy husband again, don't forget to tell him that what we did to you, as so often happens." With grape victims, the wife blamed herself for the grape and sent word to her husband telling him what happened and requested him to forget about her, begin a new life without her because she was dishonored, quote unquote. The grape and this reaction of the wife invokes overwhelming guilt, shame, and anger in the husband. He was treated for insomnia, headache, and impotence. The third cases involve a 37-year-old survivor of a village massacre and a 19-year-old former student who turned nationalist guerrilla. The first escaped death miraculously during the mass murder of his village, suffering from bullet wounds, and was treated for paranoia, reaction, and undifferentiated homicidal impulses. The second was involved in the raid of the home of the settler, who was known for his violent treatment of Algerians. The intended target of the raid happened to be away, but his defenseless, frightened wife, and the only person present, was held hostage, and suddenly, psychotic rage was Algerians stabbed the European lady to death, even though she pleaded to be spared for her children's sake. But brutal act came to haunt and torment him later. He was deeply depressed and complained of persistent insomnia, and he twice attempted self-unaliving. The patient's mother had been killed unalived point blank by French soldiers, and his sister taken to military headquarters. The remaining 2 cases are particularly interest because they show the effect of the war in the other camp, so to speak. One involves a European policeman of age 28, whom Fanon treated while still in Belinda before his resignation as chief de service. This policeman, I got a fucking restriction again. Don't know why. Where was I?
Real stuff, and they don't like that.
Where was I at? Okay.
This policeman was a witness.
What?
This policeman was a witness.
This policeman was a witness to an active participant. In many tortures of Algerian nationalists. The more often the victim answered, "I don't know," thereby defeating the aim and person of the torturer, and more reasons to intensify the torture. Quote, "Nowadays, as soon as I hear something shouting," the policeman reported, quote, I can tell you exactly at what stage of the questioning we got to." Fortunately for him, however, the screams of countless victims pursued him even into the privacy of his home, preventing him from sleeping. Each night he would close the windows in spite of the summer heat, to the charge to the charging of his,
Chagrin.
I'm getting it, chagrin of his wife. He would also stuff his ears with cotton and turn on the radio to avoid his tormenting nocturnal uproar. One day, while going to see Fanon for his regular therapy session, this torturer went into one of his former victims, who himself was now a patient. They recognized each other. The policeman found a living reminder of his sanctioned by unforgivable crimes. He was overcome by an acute anxiety crisis, trembling and drenched with sweat. The former torturer victim thought that his tormentor had come for him once again. He was later discovered in a toilet trying to unalive himself. The most telling example that violence begets violence is the case of the 30-year-old police inspector who smoked 5 packs a day, had lost his appetite, and was terrorized by nightmares. He was an accomplished torturer who, like many other torturers, equated tearing away information from the victim with, quote, personal success. His violent ways of treating victims gradually generalized into a usual pattern of interactions with others, including strangers, friends, and family members. The slightest frustration in his daily living brought out the torturer in him. Every day in the social encounter, he wanted to be the absolute, quote, master. He was in the torture chamber. He wanted to strike at anyone upon the least frustration of his whims. He brutally beat his children with little and no provocation. It was finally the violent fury with which he fell upon his wife, following a criticism about his mistreatment of the children, that brought him to treatment. Although the first policeman wanted and got a discharge from his duties, this one asked for help to continue his practice of torture. He wanted to continue being a torturer. Quote, without any pricking of consciousness, without any behavioral problems, and with complete equanimity. Got it. Equanimity. And the former was the torturer who refused to represent and represented. The later embraced his profession
and repented.
His professions and sought to do away with any residue of guilt. Series B involves a mixed assortment of cases, including child murder, the crises of an Algerian youth overcome by identity diffusion and guilt, the feelings of loss and intense ambivalence of a young French woman who's highly placed. The ruthless father was unalived by Algerians, the multiple psychiatric reactions of Algerian war refugees, the most tragic illustration of the Manichaean world and its senseless violence occurrence. 2 young Algerians, 13 and 14 years old, who unalived their European friend and playmate. The interview with the 13-year-old Algerian shows a suggestibility of youth and the irrationality of violence. Here it is, everybody. So this is a hard one. We weren't a bit cross with him. He was a good friend of ours. One day we decided to unalive him because the Europeans wanted to kill all Arab people. So we got the knife from home and we killed him. But why did we pick on him? Because he used to play with us. Another boy wouldn't have gone up the hill with us. And yet, you were pals? Well then, why do they want to kill us? His father is in the militia, and he said we ought to have our throats cut. Was it you that killed him? Yes. This is a 13-year-old? Yeah, 13-year-old. Does having killed somebody worry you? No. since they want to kill us. So do you mind being in prison? No. The 14-year-old is more developed physically and mentally, so similar inquiries as the first. He retorted with indignation why it was always Algerians who were imprisoned and killed, never Frenchmen. He also talked about some of his relatives killed by the French in the mass murders. But you are a child, and what is happening concerns grown-up people. But they kill children too. That is no reason to kill your friend. Killing your friend. Well, kill him I did. Now you can do what you like. Had your friend done anything to harm you? Not at all. Well, there you are. The cases in Series C are, so basically they see that these Frenchmen and French people are getting away with unaliving their own people. So what is the justification? What, they're justified, you know? But like the system's like not going to take those French people into custodies like they do these children. So yeah. The cases in the Series C all involve the psychiatric reaction of torture. Victims also enumerated are the various techniques of torture, including beatings, burnings with cigarettes butts, soapy water enemas, giving a high pressure insertion of a bottle in the anus, electroshocks, and intravenous injections of phenol. Yeah. A psychiatric restriction, including depression, phobia, anxiety, reactions. The personality decomposition of particular interest in Fanon's report that it is a mistakenly, oh my gosh, I get it. Just fuck off. Trying to finish. Where was I at? Okay, there we go. I'll just do this. No. Being tortured. Okay, wait. Okay, I'm just. Of particular interest is Fanon's report that it is a mistakenly apprehended and tortured who frequently end up in a psychiatric cases. being tortured night and day, for nothing seems to have broken something in these men. Those who know something tend to suffer with less sense of injustice, and they were usually killed, even if they confessed. A few among them who survived many be brought as patients with such stereotypic remarks as, quote, I didn't tell them anything. You must believe me. I didn't talk. The last series deals with psychosomatic disorders common to veterans of other wars, but also some specific to Algerians. They also underscore the human ravages of colonialism and the war of liberation. In short, what is crucial about this chapter is not only that it diametrically shows the relevance of the sociogenetic perspectives, but that it also demonstrates Fanon's fundamental doubts about violence even when practiced in self-defense. Perpetrators as well as victims continue to bear tragic wounds and the legacy in their own persons and also through their loved ones. The case are hastily put together and could have been more effective if Fanon had the time to explain them fully, but time was running out on him. In careful reading of these cases and the footnotes nonetheless impart the messages Fanon intend. One of these messages is at once an assertion of a question. It appears in the discussion of the African nationalists who planted a bomb in the cafe frequently by the colonial officials for whom it was intended. 10 persons subsequently died in the blast. The nationalists had no personal contact with any of them, and he harbored no personal grudge against any of the victims. Following independence, the nationalists became acquainted with persons from the formerly colonized nations and found them to be nice, decent people. The realization that maybe some of the victims in the cafe incident were completely innocent and good-natured persons, like the new acquaintances crystallized in him overwhelming guilt and an attack on vertigo. Around the anniversary of the event, this nationalist would suffer prolonged insomnia, complained by anxiety and suicidal
Accompanied by
obsession. Yes, thank you. It is in the context that Fanon makes the assertion and poses the question. In other words, we are forever pursued by our actions. Their ordering, their circumstances, and their motivations may perfectly well come to be profoundly modified. A posterior. This is merely one of the snares that history and its various influences set for us. But we can escape becoming dizzy. And who can affirm that vertigo does not?
Drew, go back to that sentence. You read it wrong.
But we escape
Can
becoming
be
dizzy. Okay, thank you. And who can affirm the vertigo does not haunt the whole existence? And now we're on part 4. Fanon and the colonial psychiatry. All right.
I'm getting a lot of this because it's finally going into like the really good psychological stuff. And while I haven't studied Fanon much, I've only read a couple of his books. I haven't studied him. I do understand a lot of what he said, and I do agree with him very much. What page?
222. It's funny when I read they do this, but when I don't read, they don't even give me any fucking like anything, so fucking hell. All right. So we went through a whole bunch of cases. We talked about how both sides are affected by these things and how it's geared around environmental aspects, geared around social relations, and also the economic disparities. So Fanon does put the aspect of the materialist world. So like he sees that these are conditions that bring these oppressive things, and affects the psychology of people's minds and stuff like that. So, any other questions? Any other things?
So I agree with Fanon that the outside world definitely affects what's going on and how the person reacts. And I kind of agree. I see how it's close to what Zubin said and the other guy in their paper when it came to your base level. If it's not the base level of somebody else, if you're more highly reactive, it's gonna affect you in a different way than it would affect somebody with a lower reactive. It was very interesting. It was very educational, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. So Fanon puts psychiatry also as a vessel or a thing to also be liberation, because he also talked about that, like, it's important that we also bring the contradictions and how they can solve the contradictions, which therapy currently doesn't help you solve the contradictions in the external world, in the material world. They leave it individualized and they blame you, and as they said, they bring it to an individual level instead of like all these other aspects that arises these conditions from somebody. So I like that Fanon realized, and I wish most therapists would realize that, but it's hard because he also talks about how when the liberation process is also doing a social revolution. You know what I mean? So that's important. Can't be fully recovered unless we get rid of the system that creates these things, you know?
Exactly.
All right. Well, if no one else has anything, if someone else wants to come up and ask questions, that's fine. But if not, that's okay too. It's a good book. Everybody should read this. Everybody should like enjoy it. I like this book. But since there's no one else coming up, I'll go ahead and close it out. I appreciate everybody, and I appreciate the commentary.